But we have in front of us this family tree. Now, we're at this time of year, as you have noticed, unless you live in a cave, that it's Advent and that lead up to Christmas and that special time of year. So it's a time when we prepare in our hearts. That's the idea, we prepare our hearts for the coming of the Lord, or a reminder of the coming of the Lord. But also we prepare our homes. We prepare our church, so I've got all those invites at the back while we have a choir rehearsal. And this can cause a bit of stress. Last couple of weeks, just a confession, last couple of weeks, a few times I've woken up in the night thinking about the carol service. Now, why do I do that? I don't wake up and going, oh, there's a Sunday morning service or a Sunday evening service. I never do that. Why do we do that for Christmas? And actually, if we don't prepare, it turns out the 25th happens whether we're ready or not. It's not like, oh no, I'm not ready for Christmas. It won't happen. It will. It feels like there's lots to do. There's lots to bring together. God has been preparing for Christmas actually for all eternity, so that when it happened, it was just right. May not have felt it to those at the time, but it happened at the right time. The Old Testament is a story of how God used history to bring to that point. So we're told of Jesus' birth. It happened at just the right time. So an Advent series, we could do any bit of the Old Testament, as Ben referenced at the start of the reading. So Matthew 1, 1 to 17 is a family tree of Jesus, a load of Old Testament names. But it isn't just, and Ben tried to sort of do this in the reading, it's not just a list of names. There's a shape to it with some clues. And not to disparage Ben's reading, but I remember we looked at this years ago, and Angela Stevens read it, and at the end of it I thought, I'm not sure I need to preach it now, because of the way she articulated it so well as we went through. And so we see the clues here in verse 1. There's two standout names that shape the family tree, Abraham and David. And if we didn't get the shape as we go through it, verse 17 seals it for us, that there are 14 generations from Abraham to David, and 14 from David to the exile, and from the exile to Jesus. So the whole Old Testament, apart from the first 11 chapters, the whole Old Testament is divided into 3. And if you think, well, that's just interesting, there are 3 that are become deeply personal to us. So it fits in with Matthew's overall theme. So this is why Jesus came. Firstly, Jesus came for all nations. Secondly, Jesus came to rule. And thirdly, Jesus came to restore. So first, Jesus came for all nations. That is, Jesus came for all kinds of people, whatever ethnicity or background or anything like that. From all sorts of places. He came for sinners, the lost, and the vulnerable. He came for those who don't think they're very vulnerable, but are sinners nonetheless. He came for the outsider. Now, Matthew, like a lot of the New Testament writers, is Jewish, and he writes in a very Jewish way. He's not very sympathetic to us Gentiles in that sense. But, so, as we go through his gospel, we see lots of fulfillments. There's a Jewishness about it and about fulfillment. So it's jam-packed with stuff. And we notice more each time we read both the Old Testament and Matthew. We notice more connections. So there's lots of prophecies. They're the obvious ones, and we read some of those at Christmas. But there's also types and patterns. The New Testament, especially Matthew, helps us to understand the Old Testament and why it's there. But the Old Testament also gives us colour and significance for Christ's work. The bits about Jesus, we're going, why is that important to us? Well, the Old Testament tells us why. So as we read the whole, the Bible mutually informs us of other bits. So although Matthew's got this very Jewish style of writing, his themes about Jesus being the promised Christ and the Old Testament King of the Jews, Jesus is all that, but he is that for all nations. Those things aren't an end with the Jewish people, but are as a promise to the world. So it starts with Abraham. And we've been looking at Abraham and others in Genesis in home groups. And the big theme in Abraham is promise and this blessing to the nations. And come to Galatians, we see Jesus is the seed of Abraham. to bless the nations. We become part of Abraham's family by faith. So Abraham reminds us for all nations. David, we'll come to him a bit more in a minute, but David is to rule, and in the Psalms, especially Psalm 2, explicitly in Psalm 2, is to rule the nations. All the nations will come to his throne. We start to get a taster of that in the books of Kings and Chronicles. And then notice there are 4 women mentioned in the family tree, quite close together. Now, for Jews, for different reasons, it's significant who your mum and who your dad was. But formal genealogies like this normally, mostly, or sometimes only, have the dads mentioned. So Matthew's making a point by including 4 women, and these 4 women. Now imagine Matthew is preparing his gospel, and one of the other disciples is talking to him, and they're sort of chatting through how he's going to open the New Testament. So you can sort of imagine a Matthew, you're up first, you're doing the opening sentences for the New Testament. New Testament, well, it will catch on. So how are you going to start? How are you going to start the New Testament? I thought I'd start with the genealogy. Okay. You're going to get people's attention by starting with the genealogy. I thought in the genealogy I'd include 4 women from the Old Testament. Oh, okay, great. Now that's a good idea. So that's going to get people's attention. Let me guess. There's a few sort of great heroes of faith that are women in the New Testament. Good to remind people that. So what? Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Hannah? Not quite. These 4 women show us who Jesus came for, and that he came for all people. So first we have Tamar. She's a Canaanite. The Canaanites are the baddies. The event we read about her in Genesis 38 is distressing. Some of that said that in the home group, and people commented this is a distressing chapter. Her actions are morally dubious, how she gets her sons, but for sure the reason why she does that is because she's a victim, and that's not me importing our standards back to the Bible. It's clear that she's a victim. But she puts her faith in Abraham's family. She knows there's something special about his family. Then there's Rahab. She's another Canaanite. She's a prostitute, but she protects the spies because she has faith that God is going to give that land to Israel. He's a God of promise. Then we have Ruth, a Moabite. Now, we don't think she's immoral, although there's a questionable chapter in the book of Ruth, but Moabites are known for their immorality. It's kind of their origin story. They're great enemies of Israel, but Ruth is a model of conversion. She says, they're not my people and God's anymore. This is my people and God's now. She's a model conversion. Then there's Bathsheba in verse 6. Just before we start verse 7, she's actually not named. We just told the wife of Uriah. And why is that? It seems a bit rough at first glance because if you know the story, she's no worse than the others that are mentioned. She, again, is a victim of an abuse of power. That might sound very modern language, but I think that's clear enough. There's a large age gap between David and between her and David, who's a king. So there's a power and an age imbalance. And this is a moment where great King David messes up badly, and that the author draws attention to that. And he's marred. His memory is marred because of it. But the reason why I don't think she's named, but it's her husband that's named, is because the emphasis is that Uriah is a Hittite. So Uriah had converted into Israel. Uriah had come from outside to inside, and she is almost certainly an Israelite, because we managed to work out her family as we read Kings. But she is married to Uriah, and so she's probably considered a Hittite. So these 4 women, and eventually we come to a 5th woman, Mary, but these 4 women are Gentiles, or considered as such. They're outsiders, but they're outsiders who came in. And then we read this chapter and we see they've come a long way in because they're in the very family of Jesus, in his family tree. So Jesus came for outsiders. We've thought about this before, Jesus came as a man. He became as a person, as a human, but a particular kind because of those he came to save. And so he came for these people like these 4 women. They're not Jews. They're outside of the church. He came for outsiders. He came for victims and sinners. He came, though, for those who held on to the promise. Now, what comes up next in Matthew is the Christmas story, including the Magi. These are Persians who are bringing gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The gifts that we saw mentioned in Psalm 45, in Song of Songs, about the nations bringing their gifts to Christ the King. That's the plan all along. How does the book of Matthew end? The Great Commission, that the gospel has to go where? To all nations. So Jesus' life is, if you look on a map, it's just a few miles really. He spent his whole earthly ministry. But at the end of Matthew, it is for all nations, including nations that Matthew wouldn't have heard of, like us. Now, how does, so he frames it in a very specifically Jewish Old Testament way. So we understand why Jesus came, but clearly the mission is global. So whoever you are, wherever you're from, the good news of Jesus is for you. Perhaps you are a victim and been abused. Jesus came for people like you. He came for you. Or you're a sinner. Or these aren't mutually exclusive terms. It can be both. A sinner, immoral, perhaps shockingly so. But it's not that you can out-sin Jesus' reach. There are no lost causes for Jesus, or perhaps a better way of putting it is we're all lost causes, and that's who he came for. He came for people like you. Which also means for us as the church, Jesus can't be our little secret. It's nice to have in jokes and a little secret between us. But Jesus can't be that for us. Jesus came for all. But came for all for what? Why? Well, he came to rule and restore. So that's the next thing we're going to look at, is he came to rule. So the second block is, this second era is from verse 6 to verse 11, are the kings. And David is mentioned, not just by name, but is David the king? And he's mentioned in verse 1 and verse 17. Matthew especially makes a lot of this about Jesus is the son of David. Now, kings of the Old Testament were anointed, and the word for that is Messiah or Christ. They were Christed. So this is a list of Christs, but Jesus is not a Christ. He is the Christ. Jesus, the son of David, the Christ. He is the Lord, the ultimate boss. Now, lots of people call themselves Lord at the time Matthew's writing. So, but what he's saying, and what the New Testament keeps on saying, is this. If Jesus is Lord, Caesar is not. And the modern day Caesars are not. And that's why Christians got into so much trouble in the first century, in the first few centuries, and fed to lions. It's not because they said, hey dudes, let's all love each other. It's because they said there is one Lord and everyone else is a pretender. That's why Christians today get into trouble. Now, we're meant to respect authorities and so on, but only as middle management. Jesus is Lord. That's why after the Magi come, Herod aims to kill Jesus, and to make sure he does that, to kill all the children in that area. Because if Jesus is Lord, it means Herod is not. Caesar is not. Keir Starmer is not. King Charles is not. You're certainly not. That's why Jesus puts people's backs up. He will rule the nations. It's not seen as doing so just yet, but now is the time to come to Jesus as King before he returns in an obvious and visible way. Jesus came as King, and he will return to rule. Now, kings in the Bible are meant to protect their people, so Jesus is our security. We come to him as King, and we're safe eternally. But also kings are there to judge and bring justice. So this king is good and kind, but he's not to be resisted either. So Advent is this time to prepare our hearts for the king. We think of his first coming, we get ready for his second. But when Jesus says that he's the Lord or the King or the Christ, He's not a constitutional monarch like we have. Jesus is not voted for. There's no election campaign. There's no democracy. There's good things about being in a democracy, but the universe and history is not one. We don't vote for Jesus. And this word Lord also means in the Old Testament, it's used for God's name, meaning the ultimate authority. So Jesus' Lord means not just he's the king over all, it means he's the God over all. That his rule is absolute. And this is what the Bible means by repentance. It means make Jesus your king. And you make him king over every area of life. It's not like we have the Jesus department and my bit. No, he becomes king over everything. And that you give up all claims to authority otherwise. That means Jesus shapes the whole way we think. Becomes quite countercultural. You stick out and become weird. It means that the gospel isn't just an invitation. Now, the gospel is an invitation. And we see in the letters in Acts, we see people persuade and reason people to show them why they want to turn to Jesus. But actually, it is a command. It is get ready for the king. Jesus commands that you do that. So rejecting is not just, I'm not persuaded. It is a moral choice. So Jesus came for all. He came to rule. And Jesus came to restore. Jesus came to put us right, put us where we should be. And this is what the third block is about the exile. Now, first glance, you might think, well, this is interesting history, but I can't really see what it's got to do with me. You will do in a second. In Abraham, God established a people. In David, he establishes a kingdom in a land. And from Jeconiah, verse 11, they are exiled. It says deported to Babylon. So just before that, in verse 7, when we have Rehoboam, the land splits. You've got Israel in the north, south is Judah. And way back before then, time of Moses, there's when he speaks of the covenant, there's a covenant blessing and covenant curse. Obey God, things will go well. Disobey, there are problems. And the ultimate problem is you lose the land. So because they broke the covenant, they experienced the curse, they lose the land. Now we read on in the Old Testament, they come back, there's a return. But when they come back, they're disappointed. They're geographically in the right place, they've got the right postcode, but politically, they don't have a king. They're ruled by foreign powers. By the time Matthew writes this, as you know, it's Rome. Also, spiritually, they're not at home. So when we read about the temple being rebuilt, it's a big disappointment. They weep because God's presence is not there as it was before. So physically, geographically, they're back, but politically and spiritually, more importantly, they're not back with God. And it's clear that a lot of people saw it that way. And some may not have said it like that, but they just felt that something's not quite right. Now, Ezekiel promised this would come to an end, and it's going to come to an end with a king, and that God himself will be that king. He says in one place. In another, he says David will be their king. And here in Matthew, we see how both are true in Jesus, the Lord. He ends the exile spiritually, and he'll end it ultimately. He is, to use a Matthew term, Emmanuel. He is God with us. We're back with God again. So the Hebrew Bible ends in the book of 2 Chronicles, the exile ending. And then we start next page, Matthew 1. This is how Jesus ends that exile. That's why John the Baptist does his baptisms in the Jordan. When people came into the land from Exodus and in the exile, they came through the river Jordan. And John the Baptist saying, you're not home. You've got to come back in again. Your hearts have got to come back in again. It's not random that he used that place to do the baptisms. But Jesus actually ends a far bigger exile. And this is where it comes home to us. The original exile is in Genesis 3, where humanity, all of humanity, is exiled from God. Now, the promised land looks like God's re-establishing a garden, but that is lost too. And, us in the room are not Jewish. And people we speak to who don't read the Bible might go, what's this got to do with anything? But they know that something's not quite right, don't they? In their family, in their life, at work, as you look around the world, there's something that's not quite right. That's the least we can say. We can't always put our finger on it. The world and people are beautiful but broken. Jesus, the King, is for all nations, and he comes to restore not just Israel, but the world. Jesus restores us. Jesus is the one who brings us back to God. In his death, he removes the sin that keeps us from God, so we can start to know God now. And at his return, he brings us into the very presence of God. And we have a taster of that even now. So Matthew here uses the Old Testament history to explain that here. But Jesus does this for the benefit of all people. Jesus is offered, commanded, for all people. That means when we think our relationship with God is broken, it's not broken beyond repair. Jesus is here to put that together. Jesus restores sinners and damaged people back to God. And in doing so, he restores us to each other. That's what the church is meant to be about. You know, we're all from different sort of places and backgrounds, and we have this friendship, but there will be a general friction and fracture of just sinners rubbing up with each other. That's why Christians are called peacemakers. We bring peace to each other. We bring peace in the places where we're put because Jesus came to restore. It means an ultimate restoration of the world, as we thought about last week. There's an eternal home. If you want peace with God forever, we experience that. The only way to that is through Jesus. So we see here preparation for Christmas. This is the ultimate Advent, the build-up to what we're about to celebrate. God has been preparing the world for Jesus' first coming, and through the church, he's preparing the world for his return. Jesus came for all sorts of people. Jesus came to rule. Jesus came to restore. Jesus came for all sorts of people. He's especially mindful of those on the outside. Jesus came to rule. Jesus is Lord over every area of life. That's what repentance means. That's good news. He's come to rescue and protect, but also a warning. Be ready for the King coming. And Jesus came to restore the way back to God and a perfect world, no matter how far you've strayed. And that is good news for the world, and it's good news for you.